Well, thank you all for coming. I want to start off, Marcus is sitting right next to me, so I have to do this in front of him. A little bit why Marcus for Weinstein Gallery. For most of you who know us, you know really what we're known for is abstraction and surrealism from the 20s through the mid-40s. I like to think of it as the transference of artwork from Europe, because the great abstraction and great surrealism started in Europe in between World War I and World War II. And then because of World War II, they all had to flee, come to New York, because they were all degenerate artists. You know, Hitler wasn't just anti-Jew or anti-gay or anti-black. He also was very, you know, he had been an art student and not very successfully, and he had very, very strong ideas of what art was. And so the surrealists and the abstract artists all were considered degenerate. So they all had to flee Europe, and they ended up in New York. And it was that interaction with the New York artists that led to abstract expressionism. So that's really what we focus on. And I like to say, sometimes jokingly, we focus on dead artists. But that's actually true. We focus with historic artists. So Marcus isn't what we're known for, well, because you're alive.
Yeah. Lucky me.
But, you know, 25, we're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary, and 25 years in, I think it's a wonderful thing we do. And I really love what I do. We particularly focus on those lesser known artists who maybe should have been more known. But there's something to be said for working with today's artists and getting to be a part of something that's happening now. So this has been a desire of mine for some years, is to take my passion for artwork and what excites me about in artwork and find somebody today who I can be passionate about and who I can be excited about. And the honest truth, I've been looking for years now, and this could be my fault. I walk into contemporary art fairs, and I just don't get it. I walk around and I think, and I'm freely admitting, and maybe this is my fault, maybe I need to have my eyes opened, but so much what I see just doesn't hit me viscerally at the gut. So a big part of it is I don't want to show it, I don't want to sell it if it doesn't speak to me and it doesn't make me passionate. So it's been a question of what is that artist going to be? And for a big part, because I was in New York curating a show with Brooke on some extraordinary, no longer living artists who are instrumental in the beginning of the Guggenheim Museum, and I happened to mention this desire, this passion, and this inability to find somebody. And Brooke walked in and just handed me a book.
Is this true?
Aftermath. What was it, Decade?
I think it was Decade. It was
Decade.
It was Decade.
And I have been handed books. I'm 25 years into being an art dealer in December. Oh, thousands of times I've been handed books. And when you get handed a book, you look, and then very politely you have to figure out how you can say, yes, this is wonderful. Yes, this is extraordinary. It's just not quite the right thing for me. So I'm very practiced at that, because so far every book I've looked at has not been the right thing for me. So I don't believe I'm ever going to find an artist in looking at a book. And I got about 6 pages into Decade, and I turned to the book and said, this guy's the real deal. It hit me so quick, so viscerally, and that's before I saw the paintings. That was just from the pictures in the book. So for me, why Marcus? Well, it starts with my own love and my own passion. He speaks at a very, very deep level to me. But also, as a gallery that is known for historic material, you kind of want a story that makes sense for us. So less important than loving it, but also important. But then looking at this artwork, he is everything that I love. I love abstraction, I love figurative. What we do is based in the surreal. We're a surrealist gallery. Now, you don't like labels, so I can't call you a surrealist, and you're not a surrealist. But there is so much that drove the surrealists in Marcus's work. I love expressionism. I love abstract expressionism. There's so much that drove the abstract expressionists that's in Marcus's work. So artistically, there's an absolute link from generation to generation, from the surrealists, from the abstract artists, from the abstract expressionists, and particularly, as Marcus has spoken about, from the German expressionists into Marcus's work. So that makes so much sense. But then, this is just something that's fascinating, because everything I love in artwork, and I wish it wasn't this way, because I wish there was no such thing in war in the world, but everything I love has been impacted by war. The surrealists came out of war. The abstract artists came out of war. So even from that point of view, not that your work is war, but it's undeniable that war has impacted your work and somehow has informed what you bring. So it's artistically, I'm passionate about the work. Story-wise, I'm passionate about the work. It hits every level what I love, and then it hits every level what Weinstein Gallery has been about for the last 25 years, except I get to work with a living, breathing artist. And I get to watch not just what he's accomplished, which is so extraordinary, but what I don't ever get to do is get to see what happens next. Because when you work with a historic artist, everything's already happened, the story's been told. What's so exciting to me is I get to see what you've done, and now we get to watch you over the years with no clue where you might go next. So at every level, Marcus is a passion for me. So why Marcus? For me, that's why. And I just want to say, give you some explanation of why we've gone a different direction from what you know us for. That's the best I can do. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the floor over to Brooke, and who again I want to thank. This show doesn't exist without Brooke getting an understanding of me, getting an understanding of Marcus, and putting the two of us together. So first, thank you so much for that, and thank you for the curation and all of the work you put in to bringing this exhibition together. And that's all the talking I think I'm going to do, most of the talking. I think I'm just going to turn the floor over to Brooke. And then we're going to do a little bit of Brooke's going to ask some questions, and then we'll throw it out to you guys and see if you guys have some questions also.
Okay.
I think your mic.
Oh, okay. I just kind of like the prop, like you kind of gives you, it's like a talking stick. So, there's a lot of information that's already in the film and that you've seen, but there are a few questions that I think that that the film doesn't answer, and obviously you're going to have your own questions. I've known Marcus for about 3.5 years. I think it's about 3.5 years now. And it's been an extraordinary journey, and thank you, Roland, for, letting us bring this here. I mean, it's a match made in heaven for me, for you two to meet and work with each other. Probably two of the individuals in the art world that I've met that have the most integrity in both their work and in their handling of individuals and of their collectors, et cetera, so forth. But also, I think that there is a give and take there. One of the things that I was going to say is, one of the things in the documentary and one of the positions that has historically been taken with Marcus's work is about its relationship to his early experience in New York and street art. And I think that one of the interesting aspects that Roland brings to this is more of an understanding of the historical avant-garde. And the audience that he brings has an understanding of that historical avant-garde. But with that, the historical avant-garde, Roland is correct, really responding to the circumstances of war. Whether or not you consider the historical avant-garde starting with Dadaism, Surrealism, the entire kind of swath of art between 1904 and 1950, however you want to put that. But with that, a question that I've never asked Marcus, and is interesting to your story, is, you were raised in New York and Germany, and then you joined the U.S. Army, as we know. I guess my question is, first of all, why did you join the army to begin with, out of Holland? Mm-hmm. And second, although we've gone over a little bit, how did you come to painting out of that? Obviously, we know that you were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome, but why was it painting that you went towards?
I always had paint as a medium for me. Just from the very beginning. I was in New York for the first. My chapters are almost like every 10 years. So my first, the 60s and 70s were largely in New York City. We lived in the Bronx at the time. Then later moved to Queens, where I had a painting that I did that was actually in an exhibition in Manhattan that was chosen out of one of the competitions, or local competitions. And it was the first thing that I noticed was, okay, you can actually do something and you can hang it and people can respond to it. So that was a huge thing for me to recognize. I joined the military later. That wasn't, of course, it was, after we went to Germany. I moved to Germany before I was 10. So, I was in Germany for most of my teen years. And that was a whole different experience. So compared to New York, it was almost the opposite in every way. Like the film said, my father hated New York, and that was because it was just so un-European for him. It was very, especially in the 70s, where you had New York was almost bankrupt at that time. And it was just, I guess, seeing these differences that made me see each place from a different angle. And that affected me profoundly. And I started looking at New York differently, and I started looking at Europe differently. And the graffiti art movement came, of course, later, and I started getting involved with that.
So how did you decide to go into the military, and how did you decide to leave?
Well, I was in Holland at the time. We lived in Germany, and I thought, I had finished. I went to school for art and for painting, but I didn't complete the school. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what, this is really bizarre. I'm not going to make any money through painting. I mean, it's just going to be impossible. So it was really sort of a getting away from my situation at the time. And at the time, I wanted to come back to the U.S. So the military was sort of an option. And the military is, for many guys, an option, especially at a young age. I was 21 years old. And it was a way for me to transition over. And that's pretty much what initially got me in. I was in a relationship for a longer time, and joined from there, and then reported to Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And then immediately when I got to North Carolina, I was deployed to Desert Storm. So things happened very quickly. It didn't turn out the way I anticipated it. So and I kind of got stuck in the military at the time.
Well, the reason why I find it interesting is because there's a sense of, I don't want to say there's a sense of duty in your work to me, but there's a sense of communicating this sense of remove or fractured relationship to your American identity. Having grown up in Germany, I could see that as, I think the description of you saying, I was intending on coming back to the US, it's also about a relationship which comes up in the iconography, the subtle use of the American flag, for example, in certain works. There's a very interesting remove that you have, but also a sense of duty to communicate these feelings of empathy or social critique or warning or a lot of other things that happen within the work from a figural standpoint, right?
Yeah, I think one of the issues I had going back and forth was when I was in Europe, I realized that people couldn't really understand what I was going through in New York, and in New York, people couldn't understand what was going on in Europe. So I felt like I had to build this bridge of communication. And that started pretty early on, and graffiti art and so forth became a tool for me to do that. But I saw resemblances between these avant-garde movements, and I always thought that graffiti was one of them. It was this sort of very rebellious, sort of anti-establishment movement. But it wasn't really considered by the masses here as that. It was sort of, okay, it came from the streets. And it was sort of, it was seen as vandalism, period. And it was different. I think it was taken differently here in the U.S. than it was in Europe at the time. Europeans, I think, were generally more interested in it because they had a distance to it. Where here in the U.S., of course, it was in New York, and it was just derogatory. And it was sort of linked also to these certain areas that were more or less frowned down upon. So my background was both. And it was just very almost natural for me to react to both and be able to communicate that way.
It's interesting because it naturally brings us on to the question of landscape in your work. And you know, one of the first conversations we ever had was about you flying over Iraq and seeing these devastated landscapes. And this is what these Combine pieces resulted from. So Battlefield, that's in the hallway here. Also, Puzzling the Worlds of War is in the other Geary Street Gallery. I mean, maybe you could say a little bit about that, but also like how that combined with street art got you to these kind of larger tableaus that really work on an idiom of landscape now.
Well, I mean, the experience in the Gulf was, and my experience, I have to say that, you know, I don't want to over-exaggerate, I mean, was really minor compared to many, you know, guys that I actually served with and have real issues when they came back, and especially some of the guys that just coming back from these new wars and whatnot. But we did fly over the battlefield, and that was bringing us into South Iraq because I was with the 18th Airborne, which was the support for the 82nd Airborne, which is one of the main airborne divisions that were there. And we were about 15 miles from the border, but we kept moving forward as the war continued. And one of the things was they brought us to the front line, and basically with a helicopter we flew over, you know, the front line. It was very low, so you could see. It wasn't like you were too high. You could literally see what was going on the ground. And that left a huge impression on me because we were actually, like I said, I was about 10 miles in front of or behind the border, and I saw the ground war, you know, take place and everything. But it was that moment where I actually saw the disaster of what we did, and that had an impression on me. And I didn't really think about it too much when I got back immediately, but after years passed, you know, it became more, it left an imprint on me. And somehow that worked its way into the work over the years. Yeah.
I'll kind of jump ahead and come back to what I'm directing towards both of you. I think that relates, I think an essential part of how I understand the work, that relates very deeply to not just this kind of this dialogue of aftermath that we've been using for some time. In the Decade book, I'd written an essay about his work in aftermath and the relationship to what we call the sublime. But also, I'm interested in, maybe you could speak a little bit about the relationship of innocence in the work, and innocence and, I don't want to call it justice, but in a sense, you know, the iconography or the symbolism you're using in relationship to that.
Yeah, I use paradoxes. I usually use, if you see, you know, most of the works, and I use animals a lot because I see animals as sort of these innocent creatures in this chaotic world that, where they have really no control over. Almost like the human aspect is in the animals versus in the human beings. And the human beings, of course, are almost shadowed like silhouette characters that could be anybody, really, no matter where you would be. So the aftermath always depends on, of course, where you stand. You know, for me, it was, you know, the aftermath it can be something that already happened, or it can be something that's happening somewhere else. So, yeah, I think it was just really sort of using these paradoxes to communicate. You know, this innocent versus this chaotic environment. And for you to see both more clearly.
And I think that plays in definitely to what people will probably notice is that you have these overwhelming landscapes, and usually you have very small figures.
Yeah.
And one of the, Dr. Manfred Schneckenberger, did I say that right? Schneckenberger. Yeah, I've had to say it 12 times fast. You know, one of the things that he notices is obviously the relationship to what we call the Hudson River School, also having these kind of sublimely large landscapes with very small figures that are seemingly unable to master that landscape. But, you know, as I've said before, you're deturning or reversing that relationship. There's no more mastery over the landscape. There's a kind of sense of helplessness.
Right, right. And they're caused by conflict, you know, unlike the Hudson River School, where you have, you know, they're mostly influenced by romanticism and sort of has a different feel, where my landscapes are largely influenced by conflict.
That brings us to the kind of question that I'm going to direct towards both of you. So one of the first labels put on you was as a quote-unquote modern urban expressionist. Now, one of the things that you'll, you know, if you spend any time looking at contemporary art, and Roland is right to say I haven't seen anything like this, because people constantly try to ascribe labels to Marcus and they kind of don't stick. They slide off. But I'm interested not in the modern urban part of that statement, but what in the work is expressionist to you, and likewise, Roland, what you see in the work that is expressionist, or has a relationship to maybe influences of expressionism.
Well, I mean, to me, expressionism has always been sort of a heightened sense of reality. So it's not the reality that you see, but it's more what you feel about what you see. You know, I mean, that's how I've always interpreted it. It's almost like a distorted, sort of a distorted reality, but it gives us a heightened sense of awareness of what we intake. I mean, that's always been my interpretation of it. And I use these abstract expressionist strokes and other things, and create this dialogue between the graffiti elements and these abstract expressionist elements, and they contrast well.
Yeah, for me, expressionism is an emotion. It's an expression that's passed from the artist through the work to you. So to me, it's more emotion based, and that's why it's probably why I don't understand a lot of contemporary artwork, because I don't feel that transference. But for me, when artwork grabs me, when I'm passionate about it, is when it instantaneously pulls up not just an emotional response from me, but an emotional response that I can't get to the end of, because I can't ever stop looking at it and I can't fully understand it. I know I'm responding, but I can't tell you why I respond to that. I can't tell you what the two figures that are standing together in the middle are contemplating, or the one lonely figure next to what could be a barbed wire fence, or even the sheep, which unquestionably in my mind, and I'm speaking for me and not for Marcus, which is a beauty of artwork, is what it means to me doesn't have to have anything to do with what it means to Marcus. I could be completely wrong, but it doesn't matter. I'm right for what it means to me. So those sheep are unquestionably personages. They're sheep, but they're people in relationship to something that's happening to them in that landscape, as is the dog. So every one of those characters, including the dog, is affecting me deeply emotionally, but not in a way that I'm ever going to understand. And tomorrow, it's going to impact me differently than it does today. And that's what expressionism is to me, and and there's no end to it.
Well, we had this conversation, what, day before yesterday? About not knowing who painted the painting, or who wrote the, I mean, I was talking about writing, he was talking about painting, and saying you step away from something that you know is good, or the same question of like knowing when to stop, is looking back on it. You know, you were saying in terms of your process, and maybe you can elaborate on this, that sometimes it's an interaction. It's a gestural interaction.
Always.
And when you're done, you come back to it, you look at it, say you're away for 2 days or a week or 3 months or whatever it is, you no longer recognize the volition of your own hand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for me, a good painting is always a painting that I can't understand, not the one that I can understand. So for me, you know, that's where it sort of stops. And as I'm painting, it is a dialogue with the medium. And with my emotions, of course, and it leads me in a certain way, and I sort of follow it, and it's an accumulation of decision makings, really. So at the end, it's just a whole bunch of brush strokes that really respond to me. I respond back, and then there's something that occurs, you know, in that process. And like we were talking about the other day, it never really finishes, because you can continue a painting over and over. You know, you make a decision at some point and say, okay, that's it, and then you stop. But it's an exploring while you're working, and then deciding at some point, okay, well, this is what you want to present. So it's a moment in time, really. Yeah.
But also, I mean, I think that responds to a sort of automatic painting, right? In a sense, there is a reaching of a, I mean, you call it an emotion, you call it, you know, a visceral reaction, and in that sense, expressionist to you. But also there's a sense of the subconscious which plays into these kind of surreal representations, these kind of surreal situations which occur within the figural aspects of the painting, where on the other side of that painting is obscure lines between fact and fiction, and on the left-hand side of the image is a is for the perspective of the image, a gigantic pink fawn. You know, I mean, it is a sort of, I mean, there's a lot of mythology and allegory that you often use, but it also plays into this sense of being a subconscious. Is it not entirely conscious act?
Oh no, it's not conscious at all. It is very subconscious, and the only thing that turns out to be conscious in the end is when you look at it and your perception of it, really. But during the process, it's completely subconscious, really, and I'm really just reacting to instinctive behavior almost.
So, on that question, this is kind of a question to both of you before we open it up to the floor. You know, the circumstances of the historical avant-garde were those where we had defined wars and defined conflicts, right? Now we live in this perpetual war machine, if you want to put it that way, where we are always under a state of either quasi-conflict or almost initiated conflict or non-conflict that is conflict itself, you know, non-acts of war that are still acts of war. How do you, Marcus, and then to you, Roland, see either this art or other art or your own practice or artist practice in regards to this kind of state of being?
I mean, I think what I'm doing is really what artists did 100 years ago, which is basically respond to the current environment. I mean, I just happen to be a product of it because I was a soldier and, you know, in the military and so forth. But we all should really be looking at it that way, as far as I'm concerned, because this is you know, what's happening now as we're speaking here. We're at war, you know, and it's not in the forefront of discussion. It's sort of been, you know, shoved aside. So my reaction in these paintings is because we're in an environment of conflict and we've been staying in it for a long time. You know, we talked about the military-industrial complex and so forth, but you know, it's an environment of conflict, and that for me has been inspiring to respond to because of my own experiences and just generally what's going on. Yeah.
To me, artists are the purest historians that there are. You know, if you go back over 100 years, there were no photographs. So the only way you could have a clear representation other than the written word of what happened was artistic expression. And now, of course, we have photography, so we can see graphically the ravages of war. But somehow, Marcus and artists like Marcus, they're still the historians, because looking at this takes me deeper into the reality of war and makes me contemplate it in different ways that just looking at photographs is never going to do. So they're, you know, artists are historians, they're social commentators, and they give us the permission to maybe go deeply into places that we wouldn't, and to contemplate things that maybe we wouldn't. You know, if none of us, at least I'll speak for myself, I don't want to look at graphic images of war. It horrifies me. This gives me permission to go there and contemplate in a way that's more accessible.
Right.
But also, I think that's you know, regarding the pain of others and that whole idea of spectating on destruction. That is usually a exclusively somber act. In other words, you are looking at an actual event which occurred. If you're talking about historical documentation, here you're looking at an emotional response to a circumstance where what Kendi, who is the director, one of the directors of your gallery, and I've had several conversations about the aspect of hope that exists in Marcus's work. And some of that is an aspect of the absurd or of play. You know, there's kind of the iconography of these little beach balls that you'll kind of find all over. You know,
there's a little sarcasm.
Exactly. Well, it's sarcasm, but it's also interrupting. You know, it's interrupting what you might consider a more dolorous presentation, right? So with that, we'd like to open it up to the floor if you have any questions. Obviously, there's other things besides just war going on here. So.
Well, I have a question since you just brought up the beach balls and how that's probably more like sarcasm, but with some of the more relevant, the more Like with the tires.
Can you not hear the question at all?
It's okay.
Okay, great. Keep going.
I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the tires specifically. If it's really kind of to counterbalance these beacons of hope with, you know, the innocence or maybe the sarcasm, or if it was something specifically from Desert Storm, or just...
Initially, the tires came, it was sort of really more symbolic for the mileage that I left behind. And that's what it meant for me. But they've become more part of the composition now. So I use them more as, you know, the abstraction becomes realistic, and I use the realistic elements almost in an abstract manner. And one highlights the other more, I find. You know, so it's, you know, by me throwing the tire in as a realist symbol, you notice the abstraction more, and vice versa. Yeah, so and that gives it this surreal, sort of eerie feel. Yeah. And that's, you know, that's maybe why some people have been more referring to them as surrealism really now, because it has that. But that's what I feel in these times now. Right? It's very surreal times. Yeah.
I just want to comment real quickly, and then we'll take another question. This, obviously, you're not a surrealist and you're not labeled, but the connection to surrealism for me is really twofold. A lot of people think of surrealism, and it would be accurate to say things that are not real. So for instance, and you look at any of Marcus's paintings, and the world cannot exist the way he's painted it. So that is a common understanding of surrealism, and it's correct. But surrealism also, in a deeper way, is about automatism. It's about spontaneous creation. It's about working from the subconscious or the dream state. So if you know exactly what you're going to paint, and you've thought it out, and you've reasoned it, and you paint it, by definition, you're not a surrealist. You're not painting surrealism, even if it's surrealist imagery, because it's not. It's not. You've come up with it and you painted it. It's not a dialogue that's happening. It's not automatism. It's not from the. And I think you are very much a modern day continuation of what the surrealists do, because you don't sit, from what I understand, I'd like to have you talk about this, but I don't believe you sat to paint that composition. I think you sat and allowed it to come to you rather than bringing it to
No,
the
absolutely.
canvas.
On some paintings you'll find, you know, I use reference for some paintings, and for some paintings there's no reference whatsoever. And that just depends on, you know, the topic that I'm dealing with at the time. But it has no preconceived notion. So the works are completely, they surprise me just as much as they surprise everybody else in the end. Yeah, so there's no sort of layering out and trying to copy anything or anything like that. And that's, each painting comes about that way. So I'm always just as surprised, you know, when it's finished.
Well, I think that in reference to the comment about the tires, it's interesting because at certain points in your practice, the tires morph. They're an uncanny object. They're a realist object, but they're uncanny at the same time. Meaning they morph into these rescue rings. Like you basically are saying I use them as a kind of pret-a-main object that I insert into the landscape or into the composition, but they go from being this kind of item of detritus to this kind of salvation, and then they come back again. You know, there's a spectrum that shape takes, and it appears again and again in about the same size, about the same perspective, you know, but changed slightly.
That's
true.
So.
Marcus, since we live in California and GMO is a very big topic out here, can you talk to us about how that became a topic? How did you come to have that be a topic in some of your work?
What was
GMO?
it? Oh, the GMO.
Yeah, how did you come to that topic?
I started, you know, commenting on that, I would say around 2008. And that was in, I think, my first painting, which wound up at the New Britain Museum of Art. They actually acquired it shortly after that. It was a patented pig. And there was an article that I came about, and they were talking about, I think it was Monsanto at the time, was talking about the genetically modifying, or the genes that they wanted to actually own. And I thought that was just absolutely absurd. You know, this was before the GMO conversation really started. And I did my first animals in that direction, and sort of, you know, commenting on GMOs. But this was already a long time ago, and now it's become, of course, more of a topic, and people have been paying more attention. But at that time, it was Europe really that was standing against it, because there was a real big push for Monsanto moving in there with many things. So Yeah, that affected me, and it kind of turned out, and you see some of the animals in some of the works. Yeah.
Yeah, the sheep with zebra tails, and
Yeah.
and then there's there's
none of my animals look like real animals. I mean, they're sort of hybrids more or less.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
hybrids.
Or the chickens that are on Geary.
Yeah.
So.
All hybrids.
Another aspect which you missed on about surrealism, which is connected to Marcus, is the juxtaposition of objects. Because surrealists would juxtapose objects together, like we read in his locomotive and a fire brothers, which aren't necessarily related, but you put them together. And Marcus does that with items in his work. I had a question though. So the target in your paintings, is that military or corporate? I'm thinking.
It's a good question. Yeah, maybe both. By the way, Heinz is an old friend of mine who we really started around the same time, 20 years ago. And we lived together in Atlanta, so we actually worked together. He's a great painter. But no, it can be both. I mean, obviously, nothing in my paintings are sort of narrowed down to specifics. I mean, in many cases they have dual and maybe triple meanings. But there's a lot of corporate reference, of course, in my works. We live in a very corporately charged world right now. So, that's in many of the paintings, not just the faces paintings, but there's reference to a very business culture that's been taking over not just the U.S. but really the world.
In some of your pictures, you have really strong color content, like this one with the yellow people in a yellow landscape. And I wanted you to comment on how, maybe some of these, how does the color affect you? That you made the decision that that's going to be mostly a yellow one, or that's going to have a pink background.
It's a good question. I mean, and it's hard to answer because it's not, again, nothing I do is really preconceived. So I might, for example, with that painting, with the circuit break, I usually do a very rough outline. The other thing I don't do is draw. So none of the paintings have any kind of sketching or drawing. So when you look at the paintings, it starts with sort of a very rough, abstract outline, and then I paint over it until something emerges. So there's sort of an accumulation of layers, and then at some point there's something that speaks to me. And the colors are really last, and I decide those. The colors are almost like editing at the end. It really depends on the general juxtaposition and composition more than anything.
Yeah.
Can you share with us, Marcus, the appearance of Dorothy in your painting?
Yeah.
I was going to go there, but then I was like, oh, that's
Yeah. Well, by the way, if you haven't noticed, there's a beautiful painting back here, Flashbacks, that if you look carefully and deeply, you'll see Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, in case you're wondering which Dorothy that we're speaking of.
Right.
So, just a little bit of context. Marcus did a commission for Warner Brothers, correct? In relationship to The Wizard of Oz. And I'll kind of let you take it from there. Interestingly, it very much links to what you were saying about business culture and et cetera.
I was, well, first of all, I was commissioned by Warner Brothers in 2008 to do a liberal commission on The Story, which was written in 1913, Frank Baum. I think the film was 1939 or something. So this was right after the Deep Depression, 1929. And I hadn't seen the film before, so I actually had to see the film. They sent me CDs.
Growing up in Germany, you hadn't seen it.
Yeah, and I missed it. I missed it because I was overseas. And I knew about the film, but I hadn't seen it. And they sent me the CD, and I watched it. I must have been like 30 times. And I was so stunned because what I saw in the film was in relation to what was happening around us now. And most people thought that was pretty odd because most people look at the story as sort of a children's story. But it was actually, there was an essay that I ran into, and I was doing some research on it because I didn't just want to paint. So I did some research and came across the essay by I think Littlefield. And it was an academic essay, and where he sort of suggests that the story is really more economic based, and that there's it's talking about corporations and populism and so forth. And then I watched it again, and it became more clear to me what I felt was actually part of the essay.
The historical context is that when Frank L. Baum was writing, and this is the claim that's made, and it's not just Littlefield that makes it. There's a lot of different interpretations. Is that the late 19th century, early 20th century, you're talking about the gold standard and the development of the gold standard. And the ruby slippers weren't originally ruby, they were silver slippers. And so in order to go to green money, i.e. like an emerald city, right, greenbacks, that was symbolic currency and not linked to a gold standard, they were starting to add silver into gold to extend the supposed reserve. And so there was all kinds of comment about saying the Federal Reserve, supposedly about greed, about, you know, the greed in culture that was forgetting the middle class, Midwestern subject that the Dorothy character represented.
Right,
So.
right. Yeah, and I wasn't, as I told Brooke, I didn't stick to that interpretation, so I kind of veered off into my own, but I used that as a guideline, and it sort of echoed some of the things that I already thought, and it just sort of confirmed certain things. For example, the Federal Reserve, for example, you know, it's a private institution, which most people still think is a government institution, it's not. Yeah. And you know, so there were all kinds of doors that opened up after that for me that I found interesting, and that had a direct relation to some of the things that were happening today.
Well, also I think that it responds to the element of your work of this kind of aspect of allegory in what is seeming to be childlike. You know, not just the childlike figures themselves, but also the other aspects which may be playful. You know, that the playful has also a dark side to it.
Right.
You know, that aspect of the allegorical impulse. I think that didn't necessarily start there in your work, but it grounds that discussion.
Yeah, no, it did. I would agree, because that particular 2008, that commission did sort of lean me in a different direction, because you know, I would say it opened, you know, some of these doors, and in terms of you know, globally, economically, what was happening, and I started digging more into that, and economics, generally speaking, became more of a topic in some of the works after that. This is over 10 years ago now, so it was 2008. Yeah, a lot of things go up.
One or two more questions. Anyone else? Doesn't have to be one or two more. Well, Marcus, thank you very much. It has been such an extraordinary honor for us to be able to mount this exhibition. Thank all of you guys for coming. I want to thank a couple people while I'm here. I had a baby, but I didn't deliver the baby. My wife did. We had a baby 2 months ago. And so I've been a little preoccupied for the last 2 months. And I think this is one of the most beautiful, extraordinary exhibitions we've ever done that I can't take a lot of credit for because I've been occupied. So I want to thank a few people. First, Lauren, who works with Marcus in Fort Myers. But you have been extraordinary. The amount of effort to pull everything together, to get all of the pieces here, to make everything was done. You've
Phenomenal.
been phenomenal. You've been a joy to work with, and on my end, Kendi and Melanie, Kendi Genovese and Melanie Cameron, who have picked up the ball, made sure all, you know, they got the catalog put together, made sure all their artwork got here. This warehouse was torn apart and in major construction just a couple days ago. Right. So the sense of calm to you know, as there was holes in the floor and dust everywhere, and the amount of effort to go from that to getting this exhibition up as beautifully as it's hung. I want to just absolutely thank both of you. And then Brooke, not just introducing us to Marcus, and working with with Kendi and me on the curation of the show, writing the essay, and just all of your belief that made this come together. So I just want to thank all of you, Simon, all of your hard work putting it together. It has been really, they say in many things it takes a village. Well, this really has been the exhibition where, I mean, and so many things happen. I mean, you had a hurricane centered right on you. We didn't know if this was going to happen. We didn't know that the paintings were going to survive. Marcus wrote out the hurricane in his warehouse against, you know, all probable
all
logical odds. So there were many things that you know, I didn't mention, but I will mention, because of the hurricane, things were crazy in Florida. Lauren didn't just do all of the work she drove the truck with the artwork from Florida to San Francisco to make sure that so I mean, this really was the exhibition that took a village. So thank you to all of you, and thanks for all of you for coming and participating today, and for the incredible questions. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.